Board is right there. Okay. And good. And looks like most people are silenced now. Okay. All right. Let me begin by welcoming you into our last session. I'm talking a little bit lower tonight because I don't want to wake the baby up. But this has been quite a year. I must say, this is the first time that I have ever done a formal course on the Book of Numbers. I've done Genesis before and I've done Exodus before, but I don't think I've ever done the Book of Numbers before. And this has been a very interesting experience because I have learned a lot in studying this book. I always wonder whether, number one, I'm going to be able to convey lessons to you, but also whether I'm going to get something out of it. I have truly, my view of the Book of Numbers has changed after this year's course. I've seen so many things in the text I never saw before. I've learned so many lessons. So what I want to do tonight is I want to talk with you just briefly about the lessons you have learned from the Book of Numbers. Of all the material that we've covered so far this year, we talked about wandering in the wilderness and everything else. The Book of Numbers has some important lessons to teach us. Okay, I'm just, here we go. That's me. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right. So, what do we learn from the book of Numbers? A number of things, actually. That 40 years is a very long time. It's a whole generation. And that a trip that was supposed to take a very short period of time to get from the land of Egypt, where the Jews were exiled, to get from Egypt to get to Israel, the journey itself is only a journey of about a few weeks. Even with a large number of people, it shouldn't have taken them longer than about a month to make the journey, but they did not go directly. And it turns out that a journey that could have been done in a month's period of time lasted 40 years. It lasted 40 years because one of the lessons we learned from the book of Numbers is it's easy to dream about freedom. It's easy to imagine yourself a free human being and enjoying the blessings of liberty. But the reality is people don't go from slavery to freedom right away. It's a very long journey. In this case, a journey of a whole generation, of a whole 40 years. Were there faster ways of getting there? Were there other ways they could have gotten there? As you read through the book of Numbers, the impression you get is no, there was no faster way that you could get there because the people aren't able to change that quickly. If people could change quickly, if people could experience what they experience, and then within a period of weeks or months, or even a couple of years, they could go on and start a new life, then everything would be wonderful. But the lesson of the book of Numbers is sometimes freedom takes many years to acquire. Sometimes you can't attain freedom quickly. You have to go through a very, very long process. And that is what the Jewish people have been doing. So, as we review the book, as we talk about what we've learned, let me start with each one of you or whoever would like to participate. Have any of you learned in the course of this year something that you didn't know? What did you learn? What lessons did you learn from the book of Numbers? Would anybody like to start this process out? Go ahead, Lori, jump in.
Well, I knew nothing about Numbers. Mm-hmm. I knew about Genesis, I knew about Exodus, but I knew nothing about Numbers. And I was very encouraged by what it meant to be a leader and who was able to possess. So Moses had a certain kind of leadership that was appropriate for his time. But and then as it explained later in our last readings, that how Joshua came to be the more appropriate leader, mm-hmm. and that it was not a succession of inheritance, it had to be earned, and that's a lesson for us today, that we don't just get handed down leadership or whatever else is coming, what we think is due to us, that it had to be earned and it had to be appropriate for what our job was. So Joshua did what he needed to do to show God that he was the right person to assume the leadership.
Very nice observation, Laurie. I mean, initially when I started this course, I thought, and I had to come up with a title, so I called it The Long Walk to Freedom. I thought the lesson was going to be the lesson of what it's like to be a slave people, experience 210 years of servitude, and then suddenly find yourself liberated and free with a new direction and a new beginning, and the difficulties of beginning life anew, the difficulties of experiencing the worst of human tragedy and then going to great opportunity. And so I always thought the lesson was the growth of the challenge that met the Jewish people, the experience of growing over a period of time from being a slave people to being a free people. But my observation also changed, Laurie, and like yours, I came to understand this book really as being a book about leadership. If I had to use any book of the Torah at all, to train leaders of a synagogue, how to be leaders and the lessons to learn of leadership, I would use this book. I wouldn't have used Exodus. I wouldn't have used Genesis, obviously. Exodus tells a lot of stories about oppression and tyranny and freedom. But if I really wanted to train people to understand what it takes to be a leader, the book I would use is the book of Numbers. And as you watch Moses change, as you watch the change in Moses, from the way he was in the book of Exodus, when he seemed to be just in the prime of his leadership, taking the people out, bringing them out of the land, doing what God told him. And you see all of the tribulations and the trials and the difficulties that Moses faced as time went on and the people became recalcitrant and having to repeat again and again and again the lessons he thought he had already taught. It told me a lot about what it was to be a leader and reminded me a lot of the experience that other leaders have had besides Moses. So before I go on, anybody else besides Laurie? Go ahead, Joseph.
Well, I was astonished that, I never read Numbers. I don't remember Numbers being taught in church too often. There wasn't much of a lecture. I can't even remember once the priest talking about something out of the book of Numbers. So it was all new to me. And I didn't know how close it was for the people of Israel to have had such a close call where God was ready to eliminate everything. There wouldn't be Jews or Christians on this earth. God was ready to let go of them because these people just couldn't believe in him and his goal and what he wanted for the people. And that Moses, at his most magnificent in any book, advocates for these people. Even though Moses is horribly disappointed in these people, he advocates and compels God to change his mind and not get rid of the Jewish people, and he gets God to agree to keep the quest alive. I mean, that was, to me, the most magnificent thing of all of our courses, of all the books. That chapter, that situation was the most magnificent thing I've read and we've discussed in all these years.
I would agree with you, Joseph. Yeah, I mean, first of all, when you study the book of Numbers, you understand why Israel was called a stiff-necked people. If you just look at the book of Genesis or Exodus, you understand other things. But to really understand how difficult it was to lead a nation across from slavery to freedom, you do not appreciate that until you've read the book of Numbers. You see that leadership is not an easy prospect. And I also found Moses, even in the moments of his biggest frustration, Moses vacillates back and forth. But at those times when it was most decisive, when God at least theoretically said to Moses, just let me alone and let me deal with him. And Moses says, no, God, you can't do that. And so it's some of the most magnificent text I've ever read, how a leader, even though he's disappointed in his people, rises to the defense of his people against destruction. I mean, it's truly amazing. Anybody else? All right. So let's take,
Michael.
oh, Michael, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so for me, I mean, so I've heard the stories before and never gone in that depth. And for me, the lessons were the people are people, not just the Jewish people who, you know, the Israelite who get upset, they don't follow blindly, they revolt one, and there are people. Aaron gets angry, Moses gets angry, Miriam talks God's. I mean, these biblical heroes that you know in Hebrew school they're put up on a pedestal, which they rightly should be, but they're people. They're people. They have people problems. They have people behaviors, and they're humans.
The patriarchs had human qualities too, but as you see a whole people facing these conflicts, this book does not hide anything. It does not whitewash anything. When the people are rebellious, they are rebellious. When they fail, they fail. When they're castigated by their leaders or by God, they're castigated. It is, in fact, a very accurate, probably, depiction, Michael, of the real nature of the Jewish people. They weren't ideal, but I think that some of the pictures we got in the book of Numbers probably painted them a little more harshly than they deserve. I think it was a little bit harsher than they deserve. Let's review some things. I have 10 lessons that I came up with, and you could add any others you want. This all has to do with leadership, okay? And this isn't just from the last semester or the last trimester. This is from the beginning of the course on. And we can talk about these, or you can add any, as you said, you want. Lesson number one I learned that I thought I knew, but I never really appreciated till now is leadership is hard, okay? I always thought that being a leader was a wonderful thing. You were head of the people, you got to make the rules, you were famous, you were known, you were praised. But one of the things I realized in reading the book of Numbers is it is not easy to be a leader. I now understand what Moses meant way back in the book of Exodus when God told Moses what his assignment was supposed to be. He said, Moses, you are going to go into Egypt and you are going to talk to Pharaoh and tell him to release the people and let them serve me. And then you are to bring them to me. And Moses didn't want the assignment. You'll remember that Moses tried in a number of ways to get out of the task. Moses was not naive. He did not believe that being a leader was all reward and all honor. He knew that leadership was a hard task. And one of the things I really appreciated in the book of Numbers was just how hard leadership is. And I think, by the way, that's a lesson that we can all take to ourselves. There are leaders today in groups and organizations and whatnot. Many people even believe that there's a competition to be a leader, that everybody wants to be the leader, like everybody wants to be president. You know, it's something that everybody wants. But the truth is that leadership takes a terrible, terrible toll. And if you look at presidents, 8 years after they have first assumed office, if they last a second term, and you see how the pressures of leadership have worn on them, how they have aged, how even in the best of circumstances, the burdens of leadership have taken a toll, you realize to be a leader is not an easy task. It is in some ways harder to be a leader than it is to be a follower. At least as you're a follower, you can say, well, the leaders know what they're doing. They're going to take care of it. They're going to solve all the problems. But as a leader, you know how you don't solve all the problems and how sometimes the people themselves are the biggest problem. And so one of my first lessons, the lesson that Moses had known even before he started, was leadership is not easy. And people who aspire to be leaders, who have this great desire to assume positions of leadership, some of them don't know what they're getting into when they assume the burden of responsibility. The second thing I learned from the very beginning is leaders never lead alone. No individual can ever do the job alone. You remember that very famous scene. Moses says, I can't be the one. I'm not suited to speak to Pharaoh. I'm not suited to convince the people to leave. God has to promise Moses that he will give him help in the form of his brother Aaron. He says, you don't have to worry, Moses. I'll give you the message. And as far as doing it yourself, you don't have to do it yourself. Aaron, your brother, will be there and he will help you. But even Aaron wasn't enough. You remember that when Moses brought the people out of the land of Egypt and he was sitting there all day, listening to their cases, trying their causes. And his father-in-law Jethro said to Moses, you're not behaving properly. You're wearying yourself. You're keeping the people waiting while you try and do everything, and you can't do everything. And it is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who says the way to do this is to appoint other people, other judges, other leaders to share the burdens of leadership with you. If you attempt to do it yourself, Moses, you will not succeed. And not only will this be a burden for you, it will be a burden to the people. And Moses wisely listens to his father-in-law. You remember, he appoints judges, he appoints other kinds of leaders and officials. There comes a point when Moses becomes very discouraged. You remember that Moses loses heart. At a certain point, it seems like his words are not having the desired effect. People are not listening to him. He's getting nowhere. And in a moment of crisis, Moses says, if this is what it means to be a leader, God, just kill me now. I don't need this burden. I don't need to go through this. And God has to reassure Moses. He has to say to Moses, Moses, the task is doable, and I will provide you with the other help that you need and the other assurances to show you that your message is being heard and that your mission is being successful, even though you doubt it. So leaders can never govern alone. And Moses, thank God, had Aaron. There was Miriam. There were the 70 judges, the elders who helped him lead the Jewish people. There were lots of people who came to assist Moses in the job of leadership. And one of the things that I think we can learn from this is, if you are a good leader, you understand you have to delegate authority. You cannot take on the responsibility yourself. You must see to it that you are empowering other people to be there to help you. You're giving them the tools that they need to be of help to you in your task. If you attempt to lead alone, if you attempt to do it all by yourself, you will inevitably fail. And not only will you fail, but you will probably in the process not be as effective in getting your message across. The third lesson I learned about leaders is that leaders must follow the pace of their followers. I was always convinced that a purpose of being a leader was inspiring the people and leading them into the charge, and at the head of the troops and leading them out to victory. Actually, leaders do that. A lot of people believe that leadership is inspiring the followers under you to achieve the impossible. But the truth is that any leader worth his or her salt knows that if you move faster than your people, you will not succeed. If you are moving at such a pace and you are trying to attain a certain end and the people are not with you, your followers are not there, you have to be prepared to go over these lessons again and again and again. You have to be prepared to deal with fallbacks and lack of faith. You have to be able to maintain your own strength in the face of the people's seeming inability to be with you. And one of the problems of other leaders is you can lead, but you can only lead if you start with the people from where they are. You've got to deal with your community from where it is. If you set too high an aspiration for them, if you make the goal too high, they're never going to follow you. It's kind of like Moses and Aaron when they first go to see Pharaoh. Originally, when they're coming to see Pharaoh, they're followed by the elders of Israel. By the time they get to Pharaoh's palace, all the elders have disappeared. It's just Moses and Aaron. If you move too quickly, you will outpace your followers and you will end up being there alone. A good leader must understand how to keep his people motivated. And more than that, he must know how to pace his leadership. If you try and attempt to do too much too quickly, you will fail. And you may come to the end of your road, but you won't come with any followers. You'll come with a very small number of people behind you. Fourth lesson of leadership. Leaders must learn how to adapt to changing times and changing situations. If you think there's one form of leadership and you always follow that and you do the same thing every time and every problem and every instant you face, you're not going to be a successful leader. Moses learned it the hard way. Different times and different challenges demanded different kinds of leadership. And when you continue to govern or to rule or to lead in the same way, you oftentimes lost your effectiveness among the people. You didn't bring the people along with you. So Moses's great problem was to learn patience, to learn that he wasn't a failure just because the people hadn't changed suddenly. He just needed to learn that it takes time for people to go from one state of being to another. And if you don't allow people the time to do that, the time to make the transition, then they will never get there. Lesson number 5, leaders must respect the differences of those who follow them, okay? Sometimes leaders feel their job is to mold people into good followers or mold them into leaders. The truth of the matter is, if you are dealing with the people that you are leading as one homogeneous group, you're probably not going to be an effective leader. The reason you won't be an effective leader is because people, all followers are made up of differences. If you do not understand the differences between the people that you are leading, if you do not lead in a way that is most effective for as many of your community as possible, you will not succeed. I can't relate to this so much as a leader, but more as a teacher. You know, I've at the beginning of a semester, I come up with wonderful lesson plans, and I've got everything mapped out. I know exactly what I'm going to cover. I've got my year-long lesson plans, and I break them down into monthly lesson plans. And I think that's it. All I have to do is follow the plan. Just follow the plan, work it through, and it's going to come out successfully. And what I've learned is that's not true. That I have to rework a plan because I didn't take into account the fact that not all the people that I'm trying to bring into a certain point are in the same place. I have to account for different kinds of people who I'm trying to influence, trying to affect, and I have to do it. Lori, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And just because you tell people something once doesn't mean they get it. So oftentimes you have to repeat yourself over and over and over again, even though you understand it, they have different processing times. So they may need additional time to hear the same thing. And as a teacher, I learned that
Yeah.
very
And
quickly.
you get comments from both sides. You get the people who got it the first time who say, Rabbi or teacher, you know, you explained this to us once. How many times do you think you're going to go over it? How many times do you want to repeat it? And you have to say, well, I'm glad that you got it quickly. I'm glad that you heard what was said and that you caught on so quickly. But the truth is, in everything, in every academic discipline, and even in life itself, there are some people who learn the lessons very quickly. They hear it, they internalize it, they can relate to it, and they immediately know what it is, the program, and they get with the program, and they're very successful. There are other people, you can say it, as Lori says, time after time after time, to the point where you think you're overdoing it, and still people throughout the process will suddenly, the light will go on. Oh, I see, I didn't get it, but now I get it. And it's a very frustrating thing as a teacher, I can tell you. And you think that no one's listening to you, you think that no one's hearing you, you think you're not inspiring anybody, that the words are falling on barren ground, that nothing is growing. And then suddenly something happens and you suddenly realize that people are hearing you, the word is being heard, the lessons are being learned. And that's what Moses had to learn. At a certain point, Moses became very discouraged because he kept encountering the people. Every time they went a few steps forward, they fell back, and Moses felt as if his words weren't having any impact on anybody. And that was when he became very, he became disappointed, but more than disappointed, he felt like he was a failure. He felt as if it wasn't going to be successful. And God had to convince Moses that his words were being heard, maybe not as quickly as Moses had hoped, and maybe not by as many people, but it's really important that you respect the differences among the people that you lead. If you treat everybody the same, you're not a good teacher. And if you treat everybody the same, you're not a good leader. Okay, absolutely. You have to reach different people in different ways, whether it's educationally or inspirationally. You have to use a lot of different techniques. Number 6, leaders must enable their followers to do things for themselves. I used to think my job was to train a group of followers, and maybe if they listened to me enough, that they could be leaders. I learned that the only way you can train people to do anything is you've got to let them experience it themselves, both the trial, the tribulation, the suffering, and the failure. If you do not teach people how to do things for themselves, you will never be successful as a leader. And Moses, in countless incidents throughout the stories in Numbers, is constantly realizing that it's not enough for him to do something for the people, that it's not enough for him to turn to God and for God to deal with the problem and resolve the issue for the people. The people are never going to learn to be responsible, mature adults if every time they have a problem, they turn to a leader like Moses, and who in turn turns to God, and it's all done for them. If you don't do it yourself, you won't be successful. Now, that's been a frustration of mine. I've shared this with you as a parent. I've tried to help my children avoid all the mistakes that I made in my life, and I quickly learned that that's not possible. My children made a lot of mistakes, not because I wasn't there perhaps to warn them. I think I was around a lot, and I listened to what they were going through, and I knew that their frustrations, but I tried to make it easier for them. I tried to not solve the problem for them, but give them some wisdom to make it easier for them. And then I learned at a certain point, you can't do that. They have to do it themselves. If they don't struggle, if they don't go through the frustration, if you don't have the setbacks, they're not going to learn by all the encouragement and all the guidance and all the wisdom that you intend to teach them. And I truly believe that just like a good parent can only be a good parent by letting his children have the responsibility to try on their own, to succeed or fail, and then to learn from their experience and go on. I think that's the same thing that's true of the leader. Moses is constantly frustrated. He constantly faces a people who seems to have learned nothing. Unfortunately, Moses doesn't see that they are learning. Sometimes it's very subtle and it's very slow. But Moses's frustration is he thinks all of the words he is speaking, words that God told him to speak, are not being effective. But unfortunately, he doesn't realize that you have to let people experience things alone. You want them to understand what it is to be ungrateful. Let them complain to God, let them not go into the land, let God punish them with 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Sometimes we only learn from our failures. Number 7, leaders often or must care more about their followers than about themselves. I would like to tell you that if people go into the leadership business because it's good, it's good to be the president, it's good to be the leader, it's good to have the power and the authority. But the truth of the matter is that a leader who is in the business, who takes on this responsibility thinking it's going to provide him with great reward and great satisfaction and a great sense of achievement, doesn't really understand. We will do all those things, but it will do this only because only when you care more about the people you're leading than yourself. There are some times when Moses has had enough. He says to God, I can't do this anymore. He intercedes for the people. Joseph, I think you said, he speaks several times on behalf of the people and pleads for them before God. But Moses is a man who, despite occasional lapses, had a great love of his people. He really, really did. And I think one of the things that I've learned about Moses is how hard it must have been for him as a leader, trying to lead his people from slavery to freedom, how difficult it must have been for him, how much of a failure he must have felt himself when he couldn't bring his people to where he wanted to be. And at that moment, the hardest thing for Moses to do was to retain faith in his people, to maintain the belief that they could be something better. And on the incident of the rebellion and Moses' sin, he finally snaps in a moment of anger, the anger of losing his sister, the anger of having spent 40 years in the wilderness and having to have suffered because of the people. He finally loses it. For one brief moment, Moses understands what it is to feel as if you personally have suffered. And he says to the people, when they ask for water, shall we bring water for you from this rock, you rebels? In other words, he loses faith in his people for just a moment. He is so exasperated. He is so traumatized by dealing with his people. He realizes the price he and the people around him have paid for this enterprise he has undertaken, that in a moment he loses it. And at that moment, interestingly enough, the moment that he loses his patience, he's lost his effectiveness as a leader. And that is the last group of lessons I've learned. What have I learned? That when a leader is no longer effective, a leader must step out of the way. It will happen to all of us. All of us, no matter how effective we are, there will come a point after a number of years when we realize that we've lost the enthusiasm. Moses was moved by a mission. God had spoken to him. Moses was inspired by a mission. He was a man of justice. He was trying to win justice for his people. But after all those years, after experiencing all that he experienced, and each of these incidents took something out of him, Moses realized he couldn't go on forever. And by the way, I'm convinced that Moses and Aaron and Miriam didn't die for any sin particularly they committed. They just became old. They just reached a point where they had to pass the leadership on. Now, some people don't want to go. I've also learned this too. Some leaders will stay on and on and on, and they will never let go for as long as they can. They will fight to remain in a position of authority and leadership long after their effectiveness has gone. And one of the sad things in life is to watch a person who is no longer effective, a person who at one point in their life was very eloquent and very well-spoken, and a person who could inspire others, and a person who had faith and believed in the mission and had his energy, the energy of youth and whatnot. You watch a person, and it could be anyone, a rabbi, a teacher, get older and older and older. You watch as his abilities or her abilities fail, and you realize that there comes a point where if you're going to be honest with yourself, you have to tell yourself, my effectiveness in this role is at an end. If I want my people to grow, I've got to step out of the way. And that's probably one of the most difficult things for a leader to do. You know, it takes a lot of ego to be a leader. You've got to have a good, healthy sense of ego to believe that you're worthy of standing in front of people and directing them and guiding them and offering them wisdom. But there comes a point where I think you have to admit to yourself, if no one else, the fact that your effectiveness as a leader has reached a point where it's coming to an end, whereas it cannot go on again. And when you reach that point, you reach the point where you realize that leaders have to turn over their leadership to someone else. That's my next point. Leaders must care about their successors. Okay? If you are a leader and you reach a point where you realize, I've done what I can do, I cannot be effective any longer. It's time for me to get out of the way so that my successor can come in and can do what he can do. New ideas, a new enthusiasm, a new generation, new challenges people are facing. I'm not going to be able to lead my flock anymore. I've taken them, I've given them everything that I can, but now if I'm really concerned about them, I've got to step out of the way, and I've got to be concerned, not just, well, I'm out of the way, I don't care anymore. I've got to be concerned about the people who are going to follow. A leader has to be concerned about successors. And this is another lesson I learned from the book of Numbers. Leadership is not inherited. Unlike being a Kohen, a priest, or unlike being a king, you don't get this through inheritance. Moses' children never succeed Moses as a leader, okay? Moses, despite his importance, despite his influence, could never give his children the tools they needed in order to become worthy leaders of the Jewish people. And there are a lot of Jewish leaders like that. Samuel, remember those of you who studied with me in the book of Samuel, he had sons and his sons weren't worthy of continuing on. So many times you want your son or your descendant or your heir to take over for you. That's how you get into trouble. You can't lead anymore, but you want to turn it over to someone close to you in the family, a little nepotism. The truth of the matter is leadership is not a trait that can be inherited. You cannot guarantee that someone who follows you, even in your own family, will make an effective leader. Sometimes you have to recognize that leadership requires different people with different style and even from, a different background than your own. And this is what Moses recognizes so beautifully in this last episode. You saw the story of Joshua, where Moses says to God says to Moses in no uncertain terms, Moses, you're not going in. You're not going in. Moses does make, according to the Midrash, another attempt to come into the land. He tries to argue with God. He says to God, isn't there some way that I can continue? And in the Midrash, it says, God says, no, your time as leader has ended. So Moses then turns to another argument. He says, what about my children, God? Because he had two sons. And there's a story in the end of the book of Numbers about the daughters of a man named Salafchad. I don't know if you read the story. Salafchad was a man. He was one of the people who was in the wilderness. He dies over the 40 years. And when the land is to be inherited, in Jewish tradition, you only inherit through your sons. So Salafchad has daughters. He has 7 daughters. And they come to Moses and they say, it's not fair. Our father died. He had left no sons. We are the only children he has, we the daughters. And according to the law that you have given us, we daughters are to be disinherited. It can only continue on through the males. Is it truly the case that our father's portion is going to be lost because of this? Moses goes back to God, and God, in considering it, says the daughters of Salafchad are right. And he makes a new rule that if a man dies and he leaves no male heirs, his daughters are allowed to inherit him. His daughters can inherit from him. It seemed to change, but it was actually a recognition of a certain truth. Well, when Moses heard this, when Moses saw that God changed his mind and said, now the daughters can inherit if there are no male children, he, according to the Torah, he turns to God and said, God, you made an exception in the case of Salafchad's daughters. How about making an exception in the case of my sons? Couldn't you let Eleazar and Gershom, couldn't you let them come in instead of me? I can't do it. I can't be the one to see my work completed, but you know how much it would mean to me, God, as a father, if I could see my 2 sons, the 2 sons that I raised, if they could take over for me, if they could bear the burden of leadership, even if I can't make it in, how wonderful it would be if my children can take the Israelite people across into the promised land. Can you do at least that, God, for me? Can you, the Midrash says. God doesn't even, it doesn't, in the text it merely says, when Moses says to God, what are you going to do with this people? If I can't go in, they'll be like sheep without a lamb. And God says, no, I've made provision for them. He says, you are to appoint your faithful servant, Joshua. He will be the leader of the people. So Moses learned something very important here. Leadership is not inherited. It is not an inherent ability that is passed from father to son. Leadership must be earned. If you want to be a leader, you must struggle to be a leader, and you must possess the characteristics, the abilities that make you an effective leader. When God says to Moses, the person who's worthy to follow you is the person who was there with you all your life, your assistant, your disciple, Joshua. He says to Moses, take your hand, place it upon Joshua, and deliver some of the spirit that was upon you. Place that spirit upon Joshua. And then there's a beautiful passage describing it. It says that Moses takes, not his hand, he takes his 2 hands and he lays them upon Joshua, and he gives them a full portion of his leadership. He bestows upon Joshua the responsibility to lead the Jewish people. So Moses not only cares about the people, even though he's not going to go in with them, he says to God, I have to know that there's someone who's going to lead them, someone who will be able to deal with the troubles that occur, and someone that will be able to help them realize the promise that you made to the ancestors. And God said, that I will give you, and Joshua will be the one. Another lesson of leadership I have learned: leaders can never, ever give up, okay? Leaders can never give up. And maybe that's why Moses, at this point in his life, is relieved of leader. He's close to being at the end. But Moses never gives up. He never completely gives up, even though he's lost faith in his people, even though he lost faith in his own ability to influence them and ensure that they will go on and they will live the kind of life that Moses has been teaching them. Moses never, ever gives up. And God must realize that too, because even though God has said to Moses, you will not go into the land, it's time for other leaders to take over. You've done your job. Moses, you have been the teacher. You have done what I asked you to do. You have gone to Pharaoh. You have spoken to him. You have brought the Jewish people out of Egypt. You have led them and as a people through the wilderness. You have taught them my Torah. You have been with them and spoken on their behalf and put up with their hard-heartedness, their stiff-neckedness and their hard-heartedness. You have done everything I could have wanted from you, but now, as we enter a new phase, Moses, your time is over. But God says one interesting thing. Even though he said Moses won't go into the land, God does relent at the end. He cannot let Moses, who has led the people all through these 40 years, not see the promised land. And that last magnificent scene, which you won't see till the book of Numbers, the book of Deuteronomy at the end, when Moses has delivered his final words to his people, he's spoken to them, he's charged them, he's warned them what they will face. He has given them the courage to go on. And then finally, God gives Moses one last boon, one last benefit. He allows him to climb to the top of Mount Nebo, and he allows him to see from afar the land that the children of Israel will enter. And that has always been a very powerful image for me. It was powerful when Martin Luther King kind of paraphrased that in his very famous address to the people. He talked about being with them. He talked about being at the top of the mountain, and he talked about not being able to go to the promised land with you, but God had brought him up to the top and he'd seen the promised land. That's probably the greatest blessing a person can have. None of us leaders will ever achieve the end, because the end always goes beyond this. We will never achieve the purpose for which we were called, because there's always more to be done. But if you are lucky in life, if you are fortunate, God sometimes allows you to see, looking ahead, allows you to see something of the beauty of what you have been able to do and gives you a vision of how that will continue in the future. It would be very bitter indeed, if leaders felt that whatever they created was destined to fall. Moses never had that dissatisfaction. He was concerned, he was fearful that the people would falter, but after he gave them his last warning, he goes up and he sees the land that God is giving his people, and he is able to enjoy the last rewards of a leader. Would Moses have done it all over again? I don't know. If you could go back from the end of the book of Numbers, go back to Exodus, maybe Moses would have put up more of a fight with God. Maybe he would have said, God, I appreciate the opportunity you're giving me, but it really is too much for me. I can't do it. Thank heavens, God didn't give Moses the chance to step out of the position of leadership. And even in his disappointment, and even in his despair, even when he had given up belief in himself and to a certain extent in the people, he never ceased to speak well of them. He never ceased to defend them before God. He never ceased to argue on their behalf. And in the end, because he was such a leader, he was privileged to see the reward that they were going to enjoy. So all those things, and probably more that I haven't even thought of, these are the lessons that I've learned from the book of Numbers. I will never, none of us probably will ever be the leader that Moses is. But if we have even a part of his success, if we are able to make a difference, if we are able to make the people around us better, to make our world better, then we have achieved a great deal. And just one last little comment, and then I'll open it for questions. When I do funerals, I've done 2 funerals recently. I always do funerals. And if you ever go to the cemeteries usually are built on hills. And usually these last couple of services that I've done, I've been standing at the top of the hill looking down. And I say to people, in a way, this is a Moses moment. I said, at the end of a person's life, they've climbed the hill of their achievements. We all attempt to achieve things, make the world better, make our children better. We all attempt to do things. At the end of our life, none of us is ever completely successful. sorry to tell you this, no 100% success. We won't complete the work. The work is too great. None of us will ever complete it. But if we are blessed like Moses was, and if we can stop at the end of our life and look over everything we've managed to do and achieve in our life and how we've managed to make the world a little better for our having been there, then we have what I call the Moses moment. The moment when we look out look out beyond us and we realize that our life has not been futile, that we have done very important things in this world. And unfortunately, people don't appreciate it till the very end. They're too busy pursuing other things. But when you can really take satisfaction in the fact that you were a good person and that you made a difference among your family, among your friends, and among your coworkers, to the people around you in the world, that you really did make a difference, that is the best reward of all. That, I imagine, is the way Moses felt as he stood and looked at the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, and said to himself, despite it all, I'm glad that I did what God asked me to do. All right, anybody else? Any other lessons anybody else has learned? I'm sure I've missed something. Yes, go ahead, Joseph.
I wouldn't say this, you miss this, but I'd like to emphasize that, one of Moses's greatest achievements was guiding, inspiring, mentoring Joshua Moses spent all that time with Joshua at his side, making Joshua the leader, developed Joshua into the leader he was that got Israel over the finish line. And so for me, it's like Moses, when I look at Joshua, he was a product of Moses's leadership.
There is no question about it. His apprenticeship, Joseph, under Moses was significant. Joshua was no Moses. Even the Torah recognizes that. They said if Moses was the sun, Joshua was like the moon. Meant it was a reflected glory of his teacher. But Joshua's job was much different than Moses. But I can't help but thinking over those 40 years, Joshua, who was constantly at the side of his master, of Moses, who was constantly sitting and learning, he paid his apprenticeship. He did what was necessary. He became a leader by being at the side of the man who was the leader of the Jewish people. And when the time came for Joshua to assume the mantle of leadership, and he had to fill Moses' shoes, he stepped into it almost seamlessly. He takes over, and like Moses at the end of his life, he also delivers a final oratory to his people. So I agree with you. To have trained Joshua, to have been the kind of man who could influence Joshua makes Moses very special. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead, Sonia.
Robert House, I don't know if this is okay to say, but I think Moses was the assistant of the leader and God was the real leader.
Thank you. Thank you, Sonia. I've been speaking of Moses as the leader. And Sonia is reminding me that as important as Moses is, his name doesn't appear in the Passover Haggadah even one time. Look in your Haggadahs, Moses' name does not appear. Why? Because God was the leader. And that is really the important point. When Moses says to God, I can't do it. I don't have the words. I'm not a person of speech. I can't convince the people. God says, don't worry about that. I'll give you the words. I'll deal with all that. You are my messenger. By using you as my messenger, it will be clear that I, God, am the one who is commanding Pharaoh to let the people go. I, God, am the one who's bringing the people out. Sonia, I'm going to take what you said and say one more thing. A real leader has to believe in the mission. Okay, let me put it that way. Moses believed in his mission. He believed in what he was doing. If he hadn't believed in it, Moses, even when he didn't feel competent himself, he felt that God's instruction and God's word and God's leadership was always there. You're right, Sonia. Moses probably never thought of himself as a leader. He probably saw himself as God's spokesman, God's prophet, whatever. And in a sense, that is correct. God is the leader, is the king of the nation of Israel. But as high as a human being can go in service to God, that's how high Moses went. Okay, they said that there was no man that ever attained the stature of a not just a leader, but a prophet and a person of significance. No man who ever attained the status of a Moses in the life of the Jewish people. And there were many other great leaders of the Jewish people, but no man was ever able to stand this high. No man ever had to stand for so much as Moses did. All right, well, a little early tonight. I've enjoyed being with you all through our discussion. Now here comes the next point. The story is essentially over, believe it or not. It started with Genesis. We did the first part of the history of the world. It continued with Exodus. And when in Exodus and Numbers, we've gone all the way through the rest of the history. We're almost at the promised land. So you say, all right, that's 3 books. And what are the other 2 books of the Hebrew Bible? There's still 2 books. What are we missing? Well, you're missing book 5, Moses' speech, Moses' great oratory. I got to tell you, for a man who claimed he wasn't a man of words, Moses is pretty good. There's very little you can come up with. Even Washington, even presidential, Moses was good. Moses' last words to the people when he knows that he's got to leave them, and he says, I'm not going to be with you. I won't be there, but I know what's going to happen. I know you're going to fall short. I know you're going to, and he tries and charges them and gives them the strength to meet what's coming. It's masterful. That we're not going to do next year. What we're going to do next year is the heart of Judaism, okay? The Torah is really one book. Oh, well, the laws are found in all books, but the book we have been avoiding is the book of Leviticus, okay? What is the function of the Jewish people? And I'm telling you, what did God want Israel to be? He wanted Israel to be his messengers to the world. He wanted Israel to teach the world what God wants of all the world. Now, we haven't talked about what God wants of the Jewish people and God wants of the world. We've talked about the history of Judaism. We've talked about the experiences, but I haven't sat down to teach you what is the content of Judaism. What is that missing book, the book of Leviticus, the book of holiness? What is that all about? So I'm working with it now. I think I've got an approach that I think will work. Still developing it, but I'm thinking that maybe Leviticus is a book to go into next time. And actually we can do Leviticus in 2 semesters, and the 3rd semester we can finish the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. We can actually finish the Torah. Now I'm going to be looking for other classes as well. I am now, thank God, almost healed. 2 days from now, it will be 9 months exactly since the great fall. I don't mean the fall of the Tower of Babel. I mean my fall on the floor of the Valencia Country Club. I am, for the most part, I am back, thank God. They told me it was going to be 9 months, and they were pretty much right. I mean, you know, I've gotten my strength back and whatnot. My balance is coming back. Still not to where I want to be, but it's been about 9 months and it's happening. I have been guarding myself this year to not overdo myself, to not overtax myself. So I've been doing basically the one course, and we did a couple of lectures, we did a couple of guest speakers. But I'm ready to step back in again and to do something more. But I've got to consult with you again, because now, having had a chance to spend some time studying other courses, I'm working on a survey that I hope will be as exhaustive. My wife is looking at me like I'm crazy, I'm telling you this, because now I've got to get it to you. But I really want your input onto the direction we should go. Some people have already spoken to me. Some people said, you know, we left off in the middle of the book of Samuel. We never talked about King David, and we never followed the rest of the history of the biblical period. Some people have talked to me about classes on certain aspects of Jewish life and Jewish law. Some people want me to do some philosophy classes, some courses on Jewish thought or mysticism. There are lots of courses. I'm going to give you, I will call it a smorgasbord, is that what they call it? Of choices. I'm going to give you choices and choices and choices, knowing that some of you won't answer me at all. Some of you will answer me with one or two, and some of you will probably list things I haven't even listed. That's fine. In order to pick out the courses that we want next year, I really do want to know what you're interested in learning. I really want to hear you. So when I send it out, and again, the notes for tonight will go out tonight, and then we will work on the notes for the last two I missed. But I am going to work on getting the survey out because, believe it or not, it's already end of May, it's June. It takes me at least a month to 6 weeks to work the courses up. I want to be able to start right after the holidays. I want to get the material together. I want to find the right books for it or whatnot. So in order to make sure I'm offering courses that you like, I will offer you a choice. Pick as many as you want. I'm not going to guarantee you I'm going to do it. If there's 30 or 40 classes, I won't be able to do it unless I hire some other people to join me. But I will do as much as I can. And if you, whatever it is, the subject you're interested in, whatever the topic it is, topics I haven't touched at all yet, or areas that you're interested in that you would like to have more information on, I will try and accommodate as many people as possible next year. Okay. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you, enjoy your summer. I'm telling you to go and have a wonderful, wonderful summer vacation. We all deserve a break, and all of you who are here, who are online, especially those of you who've been there throughout the year, you've done well. You deserve now a chance to rest. Laura, you were going to say something.
Oops. Right. Are there any other books you can recommend for summer reading?
Would you like me to recommend? Yeah, there are.
I would like to, because I feel like it's really enriching, and I don't want to have any gaps in between when we are done, when we start. And
all right. I will tell you what I will do. I won't give you Sachs over the summer because Sachs has to be, we have to work at Sachs. But I will give you some lighter and some more serious reading. I'll give you about, in addition to the questionnaire of courses, I will give you about 7 or 8 books of different categories and different genre of literature, all books that I think that are worth reading if you haven't read them yet. Now, some of them have been out for a long time. Some of you, I hope, have read it, but my wife, for example, I'm going to try and make this the summer again when I get her to read The Source. She's saying no. If you've never read The Source, it is well worth the reading. The Source is
halfway through it.
Halfway through. The first part is the hardest part, but it is wonderful. But there are some other books that have come out recently that are also wonderful. And I will not only do that, I will do something else, Lori, as long as you are asking. I have seen some wonderful television this year. I will recommend some series for you. Now, we've seen all kinds of shows, and I'm not going to recommend the general shows. By the way, if you haven't been following Ted Lasso or The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, you've lost a lot because they're both wonderful. But I will recommend some shows that I have seen, that we have seen, that are excellent dealing with Judaic topics. That I think you might appreciate. So I will send you, Lori, not only books that I recommend for summer reading, but if you have a chance and if you have, the TV set and all the programs and whatnot, if you have Netflix and all the others, and I forget all the names of them, Disney Plus and Pandora, whatever.
Pandora's Music.
Yeah, the Pandora's Music. There's loads of wonderful shows, and I will try and give you the shows and the channels on which they appear. And a lot of them are completed. Some of them are completed. Some of them, if you haven't seen them, you should. There are some wonderful shows on modern Israel history that I would recommend to you. And I'll give you a little synopsis. What I'll do is I'll give you a little blurb on what the shows are about. And then here's what you do. You do what Randy and I do. You turn on a show, you watch a trailer, you watch the first 15, 20 minutes. If you're not hooked on it, you don't have to stay with it. But if you're hooked on it, if it really grabs you and you really are brought into it, then I'll give you some good suggestions for things to follow. All right.
Thank you.
To be active over the summer, get exercise, everybody. And